We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service ours. Resistance is futile. And welcome, folks, to our first episode of our What If scenarios. What's up, folks? Captain Blade J52 here, and today we're going to be starting our newest series here on the channel, which is our What If scenario series, where we take certain key elements from storylines from Star Trek, Star Wars, Dragon Ball Z, and a few others, and we examine what the possible changes to the timeline could be as a result of this. Now, I think it should be noted that all of these scenarios are purely my own personal interpretation of what I believe would happen. As such, they are not cemented into the canon, but are purely my own personal opinion. Now, most of these scenarios I will be getting from you, the YouTube audience, so if there is a scenario you would like to see, then please leave a comment down below, and I may end up doing a video over your scenario. From time to time as well, I'll also be doing a video over a scenario that I particularly find to be interesting, or may want to pose to you guys as a possibility, but for the most part, all of these scenarios will be picked up from all of you watching, and of course listening. Now, for our first episode, we're going to begin with a scenario from Star Trek The Next Generation, and that scenario is going to be, what would have happened had Captain Picard been killed aboard the Borg cube in the episode The Best of Both Worlds? What would have happened if the Enterprise D was still somehow able to overcome and destroy the Borg cube, but without saving Captain Picard? What would the immediate changes be to the timeline? What would happen as a result? What are the possible outcomes? Now, the Borg themselves are a cybernetic species that hail from the Delta Quadrant of the galaxy, and they try to assimilate other people into their collective or their hive mind in the pursuit of perfection. Whenever they dropped that iconic line that I gave to you guys here at the start of the video, they introduced us to one of the most well-known and perhaps one of the most feared villains in all of Trek and all of sci-fi history. The Borg themselves, part of what makes them so dangerous is their ability to adapt to the enemy's weapons and to the enemy's tactics, making them completely ineffective. Now, we see the Borg on screen chronologically in terms of TV appearances in an earlier episode just before The Best of Both Worlds, where Hugh is trying to convince the Enterprise D crew that they're not entirely as prepared as they think they are for everything that's out there. Of course, Picard and the crew try to say that they are and that they would learn to adapt to it. So, to prove his point, Hugh sends the Enterprise D itself and all of the crew to the Delta Quadrant of the galaxy, where they encounter a Borg cube. Now, the Borg themselves tend to favor ships that are just basic shapes from geometry in terms of appearance, such as the cube, the sphere, and the diamond, or when you get into some of the games, you have the pyramid, the obelisk, and a couple of others. Now, even though their ships can appear to be very basic, they're definitely not to be underestimated, as the Enterprise D crew soon found out when the Borg adapted to their weapons and they were completely ineffective. Once the crew of the Enterprise D realized that they were outmatched and outgunned, they tried to make a run for it to the Alpha Quadrant, but at the last minute, when it seemed like they were going to be assimilated, Q appeared to the crew, and after essentially forcing Captain Picard to admit that they weren't as prepared as they thought, he sent them back to the Alpha Quadrant. Now, there are some indications that the Borg were already about to make an appearance anyways, and in some of the books and storylines it hints at this, that the Borg were actually responsible for the colonies disappearing along the neutral zone in the episode where we first see the Romulans again. However, that's not really touched on too awful much on screen. There are, at least that I would consider, some hints at this, but they never really flesh that out. But I still thought it was worthy of a mention in this case. We see the Borg again about 2 years later in the episode The Best of Both Worlds, where the Enterprise D is called to investigate the disappearance of a colony world and several attacks on civilian ships. Through the course of the episode, they eventually beam down to the colony, and it appears that it's just been scooped up out of the ground as though somebody had scooped it up with an ice cream spoon. And the colony's just gone. It's discovered through the course of the episode that the Borg are indeed responsible, and the Borg have returned. Through the course of the episode as well, Captain Picard gets captured and becomes the Borg drone known as Locutus. Now, the Borg assimilate their victims by injecting nanoprobes into the bloodstream of the victim, which eventually takes over their mind, and then eventually later on, to complete the process, they're surgically embedded with different cybernetics, at which point the individual as they were ceases to exist and they become the Borg drone. Now, this was obviously very stunning for the Enterprise D crew when they saw that their captain was assimilated. In the Prime timeline, of course, they were able to overcome this, rescue Captain Picard, and destroy the Borg cube using his innate connection to the collective. However, for our situation, we're going to assume that this isn't a possibility. We're going to assume that something happens that prevents them from rescuing Captain Picard, but are somehow able to still overcome and destroy the Borg cube. So immediately we should ask, what would happen at this point? Well, immediately afterwards, Starfleet would realize they've lost a very valuable asset in their fight against the Borg. Captain Picard, that we saw, was the first Starfleet captain to go up against the Borg. Thus, they would have lost a very valuable commander, as well as someone who had experience against their enemy. Some of the immediate changes would be that the now Captain Riker would still be given command of the Enterprise and allowed to keep the ship under his command, so as, in my personal opinion, not to be such a shock to the crew after everything that had just happened. Because of everything that had just went down, and because the Borg had struck so close to home, and taken one of their best captains, and one of arguably their most beloved captains from them, I think this would be sending a strong message or at least the Federation's attempt at sending a strong message by allowing Captain Riker to keep command of the Enterprise, so as to send the message that they will overcome. Or they will adapt, or however you'd want to put that. After this, I believe Starfleet would start developing even more tactics than what they had previously, realizing after the loss of such a valuable captain that their resources, and after the Battle of Wolf 359 as well, that their resources weren't up to snuff. Considering that this was a danger to not only themselves, but to the entire galaxy, the entire quadrant, I believe that the Federation, in the wake of what would happen, would probably try to reach out to the Klingons, and perhaps even the Romulans and Cardassians, and any warp-capable civilization that they could as well. Because this would be a threat that encompassed them all, I think in this case, the Klingons would definitely hear them out. The Romulans, knowing what had happened, would probably at least hear them out, knowing everything that had went down and how dangerous the Borg could be. In fact, it's even hinted at in the episode that they had opened up channels with the Klingons to try to get help to take down the Borg, and were even considering contacting the Romulans. Now, I believe the Romulans would have kept an eye on this, just as the Klingons would have, to see what happened. I believe that the Klingons would contribute to helping against the Borg in any future engagements. The Romulans, I don't think, would be as willing, at least at first, until something major happened. I believe a lot of the events of the timeline would play out pretty much how they did in the Prime timeline, except for a few major differences whenever we get to certain key parts of the story. In the episode I, Borg that happened just a little bit later, the Enterprise D crew investigates a crashed ship on a planet after I believe it was, they picked up a distress call. That's how they originally figured out it was there, scanning the system, something like that. I'll have something in an annotation, probably, or give you a link to the episode description so you can check out the synopsis for yourself. But anyway, getting sidetracked a little bit. What I believe would happen in that episode is the Enterprise D crew would beam down, and they would discover Hugh, or who would become known as Hugh, just as they would have in the Prime timeline. In this case, I believe events would play out similarly to the way they did in the Prime timeline. When it came time to either enact their plan to send the unsolvable puzzle back with Hugh, this is where I believe one of two situations would happen. I believe we would have a situation similar to how it played out in the Prime timeline as the most likely scenario, or another one where they actually do send the puzzle back. But that one we'll discuss in the next episode, because I think that's something that could be better fleshed out as another great scenario that could possibly happen. But basically, to touch base, I believe it would change not only the Delta Quadrant, but the galaxy as a whole if they were to have done that. But without getting too much into that and a possible future episode, we'll go ahead and continue on with the Prime Timeline example. Now, I believe in this case that Captain Riker and the Enterprise D crew, the most likely scenario is that they wouldn't go through with it just as they didn't in the Prime Timeline. Because as the moral dilemma was in the Prime Timeline, it would be the same thing here. Do they send the puzzle back? Do they send this back with Hugh and wipe out an entire race of people? And essentially, in their minds, commit genocide? Or do they send it back and potentially protect the Federation and by and large perhaps the galaxy as well? It's something that has no easy answer. Even for me, part of me would say yes, wipe them out. But at the same time, you gotta think, this is billions upon billions of people that you're wiping out. Do you do it, or do you not? Which is one reason why I love Star Trek, because of great moral dilemmas like this and some of the things in it. But continuing on, after this, I believe until we come to about the time for the Deep Space Nine series to start, or that part of the timeline, I believe everything would play out similarly until Commander Sisko went to take command of the station. Now, in this particular case, I believe one of two situations could happen. I believe that either Commander Sisko would leave Deep Space Nine because Captain Picard wasn't there to resolve their differences, and he wasn't, for lack of a better way of saying it, not to insult the character of Sisko, but to say that he wasn't in his right mind from having essentially mended things with Picard, and Picard convincing him to stay like he did in the first episode. Now, I believe that Captain Riker would be able to convince Commander Sisko to stay, being that Captain Riker and the Enterprise D crew were the ones that destroyed the Borg cube, and by extension, so to speak, avenged his family. And avenged his wife, of course. But I believe as well we may try to do another scenario over that sometime in the future. But anyway, without getting distracted again, I believe after this the events would play similarly to the way they did in the Prime Timeline. I don't see too many changes happening until we get to the time of the movies. Now, I believe that Captain Riker would be serving in the Dominion War and win a lot of battles and engagements with the Enterprise there at the helm, just as they would in the Prime Timeline as well, and just as they did then. Now, getting into the movies, I believe this is where we would see some of the changes, and as well as at the end of TNG. In the episode All Good Things, we saw where Captain Picard was moving back and forth between different time periods, and it was later explained and shown in this episode that it was essentially a test set up by the Q Continuum in which he had to solve a time paradox. Of course, eventually we know he did, but in this situation, I believe that things would play out kind of like how they did in the Prime Timeline, as I was saying a minute ago, but I do believe that Captain Riker would be able to solve this a bit more quickly, because it was shown that even in his older age in that timeline, he was still very, very capable and able to lead a now Galaxy X variation of the Enterprise D, Galaxy X being the one with the 3 nacelles and the phaser lance, against several groups of Klingon ships, and return triumphantly. So I believe that situation would have been resolved a lot more quicker, and Riker being someone, at least in my mind, that doesn't take as much crap and isn't as patient as Picard in some cases, I believe that that would have been resolved a lot quicker. But getting into the movies, how would this affect the movie timeline, such as Generations, Insurrection, and Nemesis? What would be the major changes? I believe in Generations, the original series timeline would play out just as it did in the films. Captain Kirk, of course, would be taken into the Nexus just as he was at the start of the film. Then as we moved into the later parts of the film, what I would see would happen is, in this case, Soren would try to move the ribbon just as he did in the Prime timeline. I believe at this time as well that as far as first officers go, I believe that the most likely situation would be that Data would have been promoted to first officer. And then the other scenario would be Commander Shelby perhaps being kept as first officer, with Data still retaining his current post as everybody else would as well. Though I do still see Commander Shelby in both instances being assigned to the Enterprise, and regardless of who ends up being first officer between Shelby or Data, I still see the situation playing out the same way. I do believe in this situation there would be some major differences, though. I believe since it would be Captain Riker doing most of the heavy lifting, that this time Commander Data would have been given command of the Enterprise, and he would be the one to be leading the ship. Now, I believe Data would have a bit of a hard time with this at first, since he was just getting accustomed to his emotion chip, as we were able to see in the video. I do believe that Commander Data would be able to hold it together, though it would be a lot more difficult for him whenever he was in the battle against the Bird of Prey. I believe that Commander Shelby would be in engineering, trying to bolster the Enterprise's defenses, trying to figure things out. I believe she would notice that certain things are peculiar with Geordi, and perhaps figure out too late what had gone on and that they were being spied upon. I believe that she would figure this out, only it would be too late for something to happen, or for them to make much use of it, and perhaps turn it back on Lursen Bator. I believe in this case that the Enterprise D would eventually be destroyed just as it was in the Prime timeline, though I believe in this case that the Enterprise and probably a lot more people would have taken a lot more damage and probably would have crash-landed on the planet a lot quicker than they did. At the same time, I would see this being that the Bird of Prey would get destroyed a lot faster as well. Mainly because I believe Data would be able to formulate plans a lot quicker than his biological crew counterparts. As far as to what would happen, I do believe that just as in the movie, Captain Riker would be taken into the Nexus just as Captain Picard was. In this situation, I believe that Captain Riker wouldn't be as quick to exit the Nexus as Captain Picard was. In this case, as attested to by Guinan and some of the others that were in the Nexus, he could go anywhere he wanted. He could experience anything he wanted. I believe that being the tactician that he is, Captain Riker would take a moment to examine some of the possible timelines, knowing that he could go anywhere and any when he wanted, from anywhere in any part of the universe, all the way back to the creation of the universe, or to even to the end of the universe if he wanted to. I believe that he would use the Nexus to his advantage in this case, since he quite literally has all the time in the world. He could formulate a plan, do whatever he needed to do. And I believe in this case he would use the Nexus to examine some likely scenarios. Perhaps even in this case to go back in time to revive Captain Picard as a possible scenario. Now, if he were to examine the other timelines and see what would happen if he saved Captain Picard, I believe in one scenario he might actually go for it. And if that were to happen, I believe events from then on would play out similarly to how they did in the main timeline. Assuming he went back in time and saved Captain Picard, then once the events of the Nexus happened, it would be Captain Kirk, Captain Riker, and Captain Picard all leaving the Nexus together. But this time around, since Captain Riker would essentially feel he has no place in that timeline, I believe it would be Captain Riker that would perish this time instead of Captain Kirk. However, that to me would be a bit of a long shot, but I still felt it was worth exploring just a little bit as a note, if nothing else. But I believe that Captain Riker would at the same time want to affect the timeline as little as he can get away with, but at the same time accomplishing his mission. I believe he would convince Captain Kirk to leave the Nexus with him just as Captain Picard was able to do in the Prime timeline. They would triumph over Soren, but at the same time, I don't know that Captain Riker would be able to save Kirk. Now, I do believe that some alternate scenarios would happen, and assuming that he was somehow able to save Kirk, I believe that Captain Riker would have been a lot more direct, a lot more pointed in his actions, and there would have been the possibility of the two captains in the Nexus examining possible outcomes together, and having essentially two different eras and two different minds from different parts of Federation history, arguably two of the greatest minds at that point, examining these different outcomes. But anyways, as far as generations go, I don't see too awful much happening except for things being a little bit more fast-paced in this case, as far as major changes go. To me, it wouldn't be until later on that you would start seeing a lot of the changes, such as when you get into Insurrection and when you get into especially the Nemesis timeline. That to me is where you're going to see the most changes, would be Nemesis. As far as the Insurrection movie goes, I believe that Data would of course malfunction just as he did in the film, and then they would try to capture the Sona. I believe in this case, until Data was repaired, that it would have fallen to Commander Shelby, or perhaps even Commander Worf, at this point in time to command the Enterprise. I believe, in all likelihoods, that it would have fallen to Worf in this case. Being that Worf is a Klingon, he's going to have a different way of thinking, a different perspective when it comes to battle than the rest of the Enterprise crew would be. And I believe that going up against a group of people that essentially, at least the way they struck me personality-wise, considered themselves to be warriors and the Sona exiles, I believe Worf would have been able to anticipate some of their moves a lot better. I don't know that the Enterprise would have taken quite as much damage either. Now, I do believe that Data and a good bunch of the crew would have been down on the planet as well. In this case, because it's actually Captain Riker taking lead in this case instead of Captain Picard, I believe that Riker would have been a lot more to the point when it comes to Daughtry. And I believe in this case, Daughtry would actually survive, and somehow would have been tricked by Captain Riker and then taken back for court-martial. I do believe that Geordi would still be on the ship in engineering just as he was in the film, as well as this time with Worf being in command. Just as it happened in the films, the Enterprise E would eventually eject its warp core, seal the breach, though a now angry Worf would want to take the battle straight to them. And I believe in this case, Worf wouldn't stop until either he or they were destroyed, either one. And I believe that the Enterprise E would start fighting a lot more aggressively at this point, eventually destroying the ships, though perhaps being a little bit reckless and catching some flack themselves. I believe in this case that Worf wouldn't be as, what's the word I'm looking for, diplomatic as Captain Picard was and Commander Riker in the Prime timeline, and I believe Worf would have been more to the point. I believe in this case, in order to get them to surrender the survivors and everybody from the Sona, I believe that Worf would have contacted the enemy leader after Daughtry had been taken out of play, and I believe Worf would have essentially told him, either you give us our survivors or we're going to blast you out of the sky. I believe in this case that the Sona leader would figure that Worf wouldn't actually go through with it so as to not harm his people, and Worf would actually call his bluff and actually order the Enterprise E to fire. Though I believe at this point it would be just about too late, and once the crew was about ready to fire, I believe at the last possible second that one of two situations would happen here. Either Worf would actually fire, and they would beam everybody off at the last second, or most likely what would happen is that Worf would give the command to fire. He would actually shoot a torpedo at the enemy vessel, and just before it was able to be destroyed, he would beam everybody off, and if the guy surrendered, perhaps destroy the torpedo. In other words, I just see things being a lot more to the point, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at with that. The last changes that I would see, and these would be the major changes, would be in the Nemesis timeline. Being that Captain Picard was dead, and this would have been known throughout the galaxy, at least that part of the galaxy, for some time, Shenson would have had to play his cards a bit more carefully than what he did. However, I believe that at the same time, while he's playing his cards more carefully, he's going to have to accelerate his plans as well. At this point, Shenson knows he's going to die anyway, and he has nothing to lose. So, he would play his cards as carefully as he could, but at the same time at a faster pace. I believe the Enterprise E would get sent to investigate by Vice Admiral Janeway, just as what happened in the film. However, this time around, the crew would notice something odd. And they would notice that it's essentially a clone of Captain Picard. Once they found this out, then they would know that something was obviously wrong, like they did in the films. Being that his, essentially, identity was blown, I believe in this case, Shenson would essentially go for broke at this point, and just try to wipe out the Enterprise and everybody there that tried to stand in the way of the Scimitar. I believe once it was discovered in this case that it was a clone of Captain Picard, that some treachery would have been exposed from the Romulans, yes, but at the same time, realizing the situation, I believe that Captain Riker would send for backup from not just the Federation, but from the Romulans as well, both of which who would send a fleet to intercept the Scimitar, realizing that it's a danger to both worlds. In this case, I see the ships arriving too late to be of much benefit, because I believe the Scimitar would have already been dealt with. I believe in this case that the likely scenario as to what would happen is Captain Riker would have been the one to beam over, since he was of course commanding the Enterprise. I believe in this case, however, instead of Data beaming over and sacrificing himself, Captain Riker would have got straight to the point and been the one to sacrifice himself, thus destroying the Scimitar. In this situation, assuming Commander Riker was the one to sacrifice himself, and Data never had the chance to beam over, this would leave the crew with having lost yet again another captain. However, I believe this time some of the final events would be very interesting for the Federation. This would now leave Data in command of the Enterprise as one of the last surviving senior officers, at least of the original staff anyway. I believe in this case that Data would be promoted to captain, thus making him the first android captain in all of Starfleet history. This would also play out a bit differently potentially for B4 the android, who was essentially Data's brother. I believe in this case that B4 would have come into sentience a lot easier and a lot smoother than what was probably going to happen in the Prime timeline. I believe in this case, since he would have had Data around to help him, although it would shake Data and everybody up as to what happened, I believe in this case that you would see quite a bit of changes as far as B4's future. I believe in this case, eventually B4, just like his brother Data, would decide to join Starfleet in honor of the memory of Captain Riker and Captain Picard. And I believe in this case, eventually, that B4 would have made it to captain and gotten his own ship, and then Starfleet would have had essentially 2 android captains. But as far as that goes, that's some of the major changes that I see. The other alternative, as far as the Borg goes, I believe eventually they would have prepared for more scenarios, perhaps even some of the anti-Borg technologies that were developed would have come to use in the Dominion War, perhaps even being loaded on the Enterprise E to better deal with the Scimitar. That's one thing that I did kind of want to wait to mention last because of the possible implications of it, but anyways, that's just some of the possible ways that I see this playing out and the ways that this could go down. You know, is this how you see it happening? Do you see a scenario similar to this going on? Do you see an entirely different scenario outright happening? Let me know in the comments down below what you think. Do you think it would play out this way, or do you think it would be completely different? Feel free as well to let me know possible other what-if scenarios, not just from Star Trek, but Star Wars, Dragon Ball Z, maybe another anime as well, such as, say, Gundam, or something that you like, and I'll check it out and I may do a video over it. But anyways, folks, for now, this is Captain Blade J52, Signing off.